It was October 25th, 1415. The muddy fields of northern France were about to see one of the most important moments in medieval war history. Across the battlefield, thousands of French knights, the best soldiers from European noble families, waited in their shining armor. They felt sure they would win because they had so many more soldiers than the English, 6 French soldiers for every 1 English soldier. But on the other side, an English army that was starving, sick, and tired from weeks of fighting had something that would forever change medieval warfare, a weapon that was not a sword or a spear or a big war machine. It was something that seemed simple, used by ordinary men, that in just a few hours would turn Europe's most powerful army into a bloody memory in the French mud. This is the story of how a new and amazing weapon in the hands of English archers not only decided who won the Battle of Agincourt, but permanently changed the balance of power in medieval Europe. If you want to discover the secrets behind one of history's most unlikely victories, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any details of this fascinating journey through medieval battlefields. To understand how big and important what happened at Agincourt was, we need to go back in time and understand the bigger picture of this fight. The 100 Years' War was not actually one war that lasted 100 years, but rather a series of on-and-off fights between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. The conflict had deep roots in the complicated relationships between the English and French kingdoms, especially about the lands England controlled on the European continent. The English king, Edward III, had claimed the French throne in 1337, saying he had a right to it because he was the grandson of French King Philip IV through his mother. This family claim was used as a reason for a war that was really about much more than who should be king. It was about control of valuable lands, trade routes, and basically which nation would be the most powerful in Western Europe. During the decades before Agincourt, England had experienced both amazing victories and embarrassing defeats. The victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 had made English longbow archers famous and showed that French heavy cavalry, no matter how impressive, was not unbeatable. However, these victories had not resulted in England taking over France permanently. Instead, the war had become a long, drawn-out struggle with both sides suffering huge financial costs and losing many people. When Henry V became the English king in 1413, he inherited not only a crown, but also the unfinished goals of the kings before him. The young king was very different from his father Henry IV, who had spent most of his time as king dealing with rebellions inside England and questions about whether he had the right to be king. Henry V, on the other hand, was an inspiring leader, a brilliant war planner, and perhaps most importantly, a man with a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. The new English king saw in France not only a chance for military glory, but also a solution to England's problems at home. A successful military campaign could bring the English nobles together behind a common goal, draw attention away from problems at home, and if victorious, bring a lot of wealth through stealing and ransoms. Foreign war had historically been a good way to strengthen royal power and make questioned rulers seem more legitimate. The preparations for the French campaign of 1415 were careful and showed a lot about how the English thought about war at the time. Henry V was not simply organizing a typical raiding expedition of the period. Instead, he was planning a systematic conquest that would require not only winning battles, but also the ability to hold and manage conquered territory. This required a different kind of army and, most importantly, a different approach to warfare. The English military preparation for the 1415 campaign showed a smart understanding of the lessons learned from the earlier battles of the 100 Years' War. The English had discovered that their greatest advantage was not in their heavy cavalry, where they were always outclassed by the French, but rather in their infantry tactics, and especially in the coordinated use of archers. This understanding was not just an idea. It had been tested and proven on the battlefields of Crécy and Poitiers. However, there was an important difference between these earlier victories and what Henry V planned for 1415. The previous battles had been mostly defensive in nature, with the English choosing good positions and forcing the French to attack. The 1415 campaign, on the other hand, would be offensive from the start, requiring the English to take control and keep momentum against an enemy that had learned from its previous defeats. The political situation in France in 1415 offered a special opportunity for English involvement. The French kingdom was deeply divided by a brutal civil war between two groups of the royal family, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This division was not simply a family fight, but reflected deep tensions over the future direction of France, including issues of royal power versus regional independence, foreign alliances, and money policy. French King Charles VI suffered from repeated episodes of mental illness, leaving the kingdom without strong central leadership. This situation had created a power vacuum that both the Armagnacs and the Burgundians tried to fill, often with extreme violence. The results of this civil war went far beyond high-level politics. They had basically weakened France's ability to put together a united response to outside threats. Henry V understood this situation perfectly and used it with considerable diplomatic skill. He held negotiations with both French groups at the same time, promising support to each while secretly planning his own campaign of conquest. This diplomatic trickery was not uncommon for the period, but Henry V did it with a skill that showed his deep understanding of European politics. The English strategy for the 1415 campaign reflected this political analysis. Rather than simply launching random attacks against French territory, Henry V planned a series of coordinated operations aimed at taking advantage of internal French divisions while establishing a permanent English presence on French territory. The goal was not just to win battles, but to build a foundation for long-term English control. The army that Henry V put together for this campaign was remarkable not only for its size, but also for who was in it and how it was organized. Unlike traditional feudal armies, which relied heavily on feudal service obligations and were hard to control and keep in the field for long periods, the English army of 1415 was largely a paid professional force. This making the English army professional had deep implications that went beyond just military organization. Professional soldiers were not only more disciplined and trainable than feudal soldiers, but also better at adapting to new tactics and technologies. They could be trained in specific formations, disciplined to keep those formations under pressure, and most importantly, equipped with standardized weapons that made them most effective as a group. The most distinctive part of this professional army was its corps of archers. These were not simply peasants recruited with makeshift bows, but professional soldiers who had spent years mastering their weapon. A medieval English archer's training began in childhood and continued throughout life. The strength needed to pull back an English warbow was so great that it created characteristic physical changes in the archer's skeletons, marks that modern archaeologists can still identify in medieval remains. But it wasn't just the archers' individual skill that made them so effective. It was also the way they were organized, equipped, and used in battle. The English longbow archers of 1415 represented the result of decades of experimenting with tactics and developing technology. They were the most advanced example of a military revolution that was changing the nature of medieval warfare. This revolution wasn't just about bows and arrows. It was about a completely different approach to warfare that valued being able to change tactics quickly, coordinating different types of fighters, and, most importantly, the ability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The English longbow archers were just the most visible part of a bigger military system that had learned to bring together different types of fighters into a unified, mutually supporting force. The English army's journey through France in 1415 began with considerable promise. Henry V had chosen Harfleur as his first objective, a strategically smart decision that showed his understanding of both military and economic considerations. Harfleur was not only an important port that could serve as a permanent base for English operations, but also a symbol of French power whose capture would send a clear message about English intentions. The siege of Harfleur, however, proved longer and more costly than Henry V had expected. The city held out for over a month, And when it finally surrendered in late September, the English army had paid a terrible price, not only in terms of soldiers killed in direct combat, but also due to disease that had killed many in the English ranks during the long siege. Dysentery in particular had spread quickly through the English camp, killing soldiers in alarming numbers and leaving many others too weak to continue the campaign. Estimates suggest that Henry V lost about a third of his original army during the siege of Harfleur, a devastating loss that completely changed the nature of the campaign he had planned. Faced with this situation, Henry V had an important choice that would define not only the rest of the campaign, but potentially his entire time as king. He could consolidate his conquests, establish a strong garrison at Harfleur, and return to England to plan a future campaign with a fresh army. This would be the careful decision, the one that would minimize risk and keep what had been gained. Alternatively, he could attempt a daring march through French territory to Calais, the English stronghold in northern France. This option offered the possibility of significant military glory if successful, but also carried huge risks. With a smaller and weaker army, such a march through hostile territory would be extremely dangerous, especially if the French managed to put together a coordinated military response. Henry V's decision to attempt the march to Calais showed a lot about his character and his understanding of medieval politics. He knew that returning to England after capturing only one city, however important, would not provide the kind of prestige and legitimacy he needed to strengthen his reign and justify the enormous costs of the campaign. Medieval warfare was not just about taking over territory, it was also about displays of royal bravery and military leadership. The march that followed was a terrible experience for the English army. Moving through a country largely destroyed by decades of on-and-off warfare, the English soldiers found little food and faced constant hostility from the local people. What had been planned as a victorious march quickly became a fight for survival. The situation got worse as the French began to organize a military response. News of the fall of Harfleur and the English march afterward finally did what years of civil war had failed to do, temporarily unite the warring French groups against a common enemy. Nobles who had been fighting each other only weeks before now worked together to face the English threat. The French army that gathered to face Henry V was impressive in almost every way you could measure. It outnumbered the English by a lot, was made up of the best of the French military nobility, and was fighting on its own territory with secure supply lines. Most importantly, it was led by commanders who had carefully studied previous French defeats and believed they had figured out ways to stop English tactical advantages. French confidence was understandable and seemed well-founded. French heavy cavalry had ruled European battlefields for centuries, and despite defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, it remained a powerful force when used correctly. French commanders had analyzed these previous defeats and concluded that they resulted mainly from tactical mistakes and lack of discipline, not from basic problems in their military capabilities. French preparations for the upcoming battle reflected this analysis. They had developed specific tactics designed to stop the effectiveness of English longbow archers, including the use of armored cavalry to break up archer formations and flanking tactics to prevent direct frontal attacks on fortified English positions. On paper, these tactical innovations seemed to address weaknesses that had been used against them in previous battles, but there were parts of the situation that French commanders had not fully understood. The making the English army professional, the increasing sophistication of its combined arms tactics, and especially the technological developments in its archery equipment, represented big changes that went beyond the simple tactical lessons of previous battles. The war was changing in ways that traditional French military experience had not fully expected. As the two armies came together at what would become the Battlefield of Agincourt, both sides were confident of their chances of victory. The French based their confidence on overwhelming numbers, better quality of individual equipment, and what they believed to be an improved understanding of English tactics. The English, on the other hand, relied on their battle-tested tactical innovations, the professional quality of their soldiers, and most importantly, on developments in their weapons that they believed would give them a decisive advantage. The reality was that both sides were partly right in their assessments, but also partly blind to important things that would determine the outcome of the battle. The French did indeed have big advantages in terms of numbers and individual equipment, but they had underestimated how much the war was changing. The British did have significant tactical and technological innovations, but they were betting everything on their ability to make these innovations work under the most challenging conditions possible. The stage was set for one of the most important battles in medieval history, a fight that would not only determine the fate of Henry V's campaign, but also show which approach to medieval warfare would prove better in the emerging era. It was a struggle between the old and the new, between tradition and innovation, between the established power of the feudal aristocracy and the revolutionary possibilities of modern professional warfare. When the English army finally saw the French forces gathered near the small village of Agincourt, the difference in numbers was shocking, even to veteran soldiers used to unfavorable odds. Modern estimates of French strength vary widely, but reliable sources suggest the French had at least a 5-to-1 number advantage, and possibly as much as 6-to-1. For an army already weakened by disease and hardship, facing such odds seemed nearly impossible. However, Henry V and his commanders had expected this situation and developed a specific strategy to deal with it. They understood that trying to fight a regular battle against such numbers would be suicidal. Instead, they needed to create conditions that would cancel out the French number advantage and allow the English advantages in quality to be used to the fullest. The choice of battlefield was important to this strategy. The land near Agincourt offered certain defensive advantages that could be used by a smaller army fighting a larger one. The field was located between two wooded areas that would limit the French ability to use their number advantage to go around the English positions. More importantly, recent heavy rains had turned the field into a muddy mess that could significantly slow down the movement of the French heavy cavalry. But even with these terrain advantages, the English needed something more to even the odds. They needed a technological or tactical advantage big enough to make up for their fewer numbers. Fortunately for them, they had just such an advantage, though its full extent was not immediately clear to either them or their French enemies. The secret weapon that would give the English their decisive advantage wasn't really secret in the traditional sense. It was something that had been in development for decades and had been used in different forms in previous battles. But at Agincourt, this weapon would achieve a form of tactical perfection and effectiveness that would completely change the nature of medieval warfare. On the morning of October 25, 1415, as both armies prepared for battle, few observers would have guessed that they were about to see one of the most significant turning points in military history. Most would have assumed that the outcome would be determined by traditional factors: numbers, individual quality of equipment, and the courage of individual soldiers. Few understood that they were about to see a demonstration of the power of systematic technological innovation to change the military balance. The English preparations on the morning of the battle showed the sophistication of their military planning. Each part of their army had been positioned not as an independent unit, but as part of an integrated system designed to maximize their combined effectiveness. The English men-at-arms were positioned to protect the archers, while the archers provided covering fire. This coordination between different types of soldiers represented a big change in medieval military tactics. But the most important part of the English preparations involved their corps of archers. These professional soldiers spent the morning preparing not only their individual weapons, but also the tactical and technological innovations that would make their resistance possible. They were about to show the result of decades of English military development, a combination of individual training, technological innovation, and tactical sophistication that represented something genuinely new in medieval warfare. The hours leading up to the battle were marked by a series of talks that showed a lot about the mindsets of both sides. The French offered the English the chance to surrender on relatively honorable terms, an offer that showed both their confidence in victory and a genuine desire to avoid what promised to be a massacre. Henry V rejected these offers, not out of arrogance, but because he understood that his political situation demanded a dramatic display of military skill. As the morning went on, and it became clear that battle was unavoidable, both sides finished their preparations. The French put their traditional heavy cavalry formations in place, confident that the sheer force of their attack would be enough to crush any English resistance. They had studied English defensive tactics in previous battles and developed strategies they believed would be effective. The English, on the other hand, finished preparations that went far beyond simple tactical positioning. They put in place innovations in equipment, formation, and coordination that represented the state-of-the-art in medieval military technology. Most importantly, they prepared what would become the decisive weapon of the battle, an innovation that combined traditional technical elements with revolutionary improvements that multiplied its effectiveness many times over. This weapon was not simply a single device, but an integrated system that depended on precise coordination between multiple parts and operators. It was the product of decades of experimenting, refining, and professional training. It was a manifestation of a completely different approach to warfare that valued systematic innovation over individual tradition. When the battle finally began, the French carried out their charge with all the magnificence and power medieval cavalry could muster. Thousands of armored knights, riding the finest horses in Europe and carrying the finest weapons money could buy, charged across the muddy field toward the English lines. It was a sight that had terrified armies across Europe for centuries, but as the French charge got closer to the English positions, something amazing happened. The secret weapon the English had so carefully prepared showed its devastating effectiveness. In a matter of minutes, Europe's most powerful cavalry force was turned into a confused mass of fallen men and horses struggling desperately in the thick mud of the battlefield. What had happened was not simply a tactical victory, but a revolution in military warfare that would forever change the balance of power between different types of soldiers. The British secret weapon had proven that technological and tactical innovation could overcome traditional advantages in numbers and quality, in ways few people at the time had imagined possible. This revolutionary weapon was the English longbow. But not simply the longbow as an individual weapon. It was the longbow as an integrated weapon system used by professionally trained archers in coordinated tactics that maximized their combined effectiveness. It was a combination of technological innovation, professional training, and tactical sophistication that represented a new era in medieval warfare. The English longbow of 1415 was very different from bows used in previous battles. Decades of experimenting had resulted in big improvements in design, materials, and craftsmanship that increased both its power and accuracy. These bows were made of specially selected yew wood, cured through processes that took years to complete, handcrafted by skilled craftsmen who fully understood the complexities of their design. The draw strength of these bows was extraordinary, often exceeding 150 pounds and sometimes reaching 180 pounds. For comparison, modern hunting bows usually have draw strengths between 40 and 70 pounds. The strength required to effectively use an English warbow was far beyond what casual soldiers could do. It required years of professional training and physical conditioning. But the true secret of the longbow's effectiveness was not just in its individual power. It was in the way multiple archers could coordinate their fire to create effects far greater than the sum of their individual parts. When hundreds of archers fired at the same time, they could create a density of arrows that was practically impossible for attacking forces to avoid or defend against. The arrows used by English archers at Agincourt were themselves products of significant technological innovation. They were longer than typical arrows of the period, allowing for greater accuracy and penetration. Their tips were made of high-quality steel forged specifically to go through plate armor. Most importantly, they were made in a way that allowed archers to keep up high rates of fire without losing accuracy. The tactics of using these longbows had been refined through decades of battle experience. English archers did not simply fire on their own at targets they chose. Instead, they worked under centralized command that directed their combined fire against specific points in enemy formations. This tactical coordination turned individual archers into parts of a devastatingly effective war machine. When the French cavalry attacked at Agincourt, they faced not just individual archers, but an integrated weapon system specifically designed to deal with heavy cavalry attacks. The archers were positioned behind sharp wooden stake barriers that protected against direct charges, but were also arranged in a way that allowed overlapping fields of fire, creating an effective kill zone in front of the English positions. The result was devastating. As the French cavalry charged across the muddy field, they were hit by a volume of missile fire that was literally unmatched in medieval warfare. Thousands of steel arrows flew through the air, finding gaps in armor, killing horses and creating such a density of arrows that it was effectively impossible for the attackers to keep formation or momentum. The combination of the thick mud of the battlefield, the deadly accuracy of the English archers, and the sheer volume of arrows created conditions that completely canceled out the traditional advantages of the French heavy cavalry. Knights who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat found themselves fighting on foot in the mud, their horses dead or wounded, their formations broken, and their mobility eliminated. But the effectiveness of the English longbow system didn't stop with its ability to break the first cavalry charge. As the battle continued, the archers showed a tactical flexibility that was equally revolutionary. When French knights managed to reach the English lines, the archers could quickly switch to close combat using axes and other secondary weapons, while their comrades continued to provide supporting fire. This tactical flexibility was possible because English archers were not simply archery specialists. They were professional soldiers who had been trained in multiple types of combat and understood how to work effectively as part of an integrated military force. Their military education went far beyond simple mastery of individual weapons to include an understanding of tactics, teamwork, and being able to adapt under pressure. The destruction inflicted by English longbow archers on the French cavalry at Agincourt was so complete that it basically changed how people at the time thought about the balance between different types of military combat. In a matter of hours, centuries of heavy cavalry dominance were shown to be vulnerable to innovations in professionally armed and tactically smart infantry. The results of the battle went far beyond the immediate fate of the armies involved. Agincourt showed that technological and tactical innovation could overcome traditional advantages in a way that forced a complete rethinking of medieval military strategy. The superiority of the English longbow at Agincourt sent shockwaves through the European military community that echoed for decades. For the English, the victory proved that decades of investment in military development and professional training were worth it. It proved that their approach to warfare, which valued systematic innovation over individual tradition, was not only workable, but potentially dominant. For the French, the defeat forced a painful rethinking of their basic military assumptions and highlighted the need to adapt to the changing realities of medieval warfare. The Battle of Agincourt represented in many ways the high point in the evolution of the English longbow as a weapon of war. All the innovations, refinements, and tactical developments of the previous decades came together on this battlefield to produce a demonstration of military effectiveness rarely matched in history. It was the moment when a secret weapon proved not only effective but revolutionary in what it meant for the future of warfare. As the sun set over the battlefield of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, it was clear that something basic had changed in the nature of medieval warfare. The English longbow archer's secret weapon had not only secured an unlikely victory, but had shown a new military reality that would change European battlefields for generations to come. But to fully understand the revolutionary impact of this weapon, we need to look in more detail at how it worked and why it was so devastatingly effective. The English longbow was not simply a larger version of traditional bows. It was a weapon that had changed through generations of practical use, technical refinement, and tactical innovation to become something qualitatively different from any previous weapon system. Making an English longbow was a years-long process and required craftsman skills few masters had. The yew wood used had to be carefully selected, with craftsmen looking for specific trees grown under particular conditions. The wood's grain, density, and elastic properties were all critical factors determining the final quality of the weapon. The wood's curing process was equally critical. The wood needed to be dried slowly and evenly over several years, a process that could not be rushed without hurting the structural integrity of the final bow. During this period, the wood was regularly checked and treated to prevent cracks, warps, or other defects that could make the weapon useless. Once the wood was finally ready, the process of shaping the bow required a deep understanding of both the physics and anatomy of the weapon. Each bow had to be individually made to maximize its strength, speed, and accuracy. This meant that no two bows were exactly alike, but they all followed design principles that had been refined through decades of experimenting. The draw force of a typical English longbow varied depending on the individual archer's body, but most fell in the 150 to 180 pound range. To put this in perspective, modern war bows rarely exceed 70 pounds. And even Olympic competition bows are usually only 40 to 50 pounds. The strength needed to use an English longbow was at the upper limit of what the human body could keep up for long periods. This extreme strength wasn't just a matter of raw power. It allowed arrows to be shot at speeds much greater than those possible with weaker bows. Higher speeds meant flatter paths, greater accuracy at long ranges, and most importantly, greater penetrating power when the arrows hit their targets. Penetration was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the English longbow system. Arrows fired from these bows could go through plate armor at distances other bows of the time would have considered impossible. This was due not simply to the strength of the bow itself, but also to the specialized design of the arrows themselves. English war arrows were very different from traditional hunting arrows. They were longer, typically between 30 and 36 inches, compared to the 24 to 28 inches of typical hunting arrows. This extra length provided greater stability in flight and allowed for a fuller draw of the bow, getting the most energy transferred to the arrow. War arrowheads were masterpieces of medieval metalworking, made of high-quality steel and forged specifically for armor penetration. These tips were long, narrow, and extremely sharp. Some were designed with specific shapes that got the most out of their ability to find and use gaps in jointed armor. But perhaps more important than any individual element was the standardization of these arrows. Unlike most medieval weapons, which were largely one-of-a-kind handcrafted products, English war arrows were made to precise specifications that ensured consistency in weight, balance, and performance. This standardization allowed archers to keep high accuracy and rate of fire, even under extreme battle pressure. The training required to become good with an English longbow was extraordinary, even by medieval military standards. Most archers began their training in childhood, often at the age of 7 or 8. Developing the strength necessary to pull back a full warbow took years of progressive exercise and physical conditioning. This training wasn't simply a matter of developing brute strength. Archers had to learn extremely precise shooting techniques that got the most out of both the power and accuracy of their weapons. They had to master the art of shooting quickly without losing accuracy, a skill that required extraordinary muscle coordination and fine control. Most importantly, archers had to learn to work effectively as part of a coordinated military unit. They had to understand how timing, targeting, and coordination of fire could be used to get the most out of the combined impact of their weapons. This tactical part of their training was perhaps even more important than their individual technical mastery. The physical effects of this intensive training were dramatic and permanent. Skeletons of medieval English archers show characteristic changes resulting from prolonged use of high-force bows. The bones of the right arm are always larger and denser than those of the left arm. The spine shows specific adaptations to withstand the uneven stresses of repeated archery. These skeleton changes were not simply interesting body facts, They represented working adaptations that allowed archers to use their weapons with efficiency and precision impossible for untrained individuals. Basically, English archers had been physically changed by their weapons, becoming specialized parts of a larger weapon system. When these highly trained archers were organized into tactical units on the battlefield of Agincourt, they represented something genuinely new in medieval warfare. They were not simply individual soldiers with weapons, but parts of an integrated military machine that had been made to work best against specific types of targets. The tactical organization of the English longbow archers showed decades of experimenting and refining. They were positioned in ways that allowed overlapping fields of fire, making sure that no area in front of the English positions was left unprotected. They were organized under centralized command that could direct their combined fire against specific points in the enemy formations. This tactical coordination was possible due to the archers' professional training, but also due to command and communication systems that had been specifically developed to get the most effectiveness out of fire coordination. Commanders could direct the fire of hundreds of archers with precision, enabling devastating concentrated attacks against specific targets. The firing speed of English archers was another factor that added to their amazing effectiveness. Experienced archers could keep rates of fire of 10 to 12 arrows per minute for long periods, with bursts of up to 20 arrows per minute for short periods. When multiplied by hundreds of archers working at the same time, this created arrow densities that were literally unmatched in medieval warfare. To put this in perspective, consider that a group of 500 archers could fire about 5,000 arrows per minute at steady rates of fire, or up to 10,000 arrows per minute in bursts. This arrow density created a battlefield environment basically different from anything that had previously existed in medieval warfare. The combined accuracy of these archers was equally impressive. While individual archers could miss their targets, the sheer volume of arrows made sure that the vast majority would find targets within enemy formations. More importantly, tactical coordination allowed this fire to be focused against specific points, creating local effects that were far greater than the spread-out impact of uncoordinated fire. When the French cavalry charged at Agincourt, they faced not only archers, but also an integrated weapon system, specifically designed to stop heavy cavalry attacks. The sharp stakes protecting the archers forced the knights to approach through specific paths where archery fire could be more effectively focused. As the French knights entered these killing zones, they were hit by a volume of fire that exceeded anything they had ever experienced before. Thousands of steel arrows flew through the air, creating a barrage that was both mentally terrifying and physically devastating. Horses were killed in large numbers, forcing knights to fight on foot in the thick mud. The mental impact of this barrage was perhaps as important as its direct physical effects. Medieval cavalry relied heavily on momentum and confidence for its effectiveness. When this momentum was broken by archery fire, the knights found themselves fighting under conditions they were not prepared for and unfamiliar with. The battlefield's mud, created by heavy rains in the days before, greatly increased the effectiveness of the English longbow system. Knights who might normally have recovered from wounds or setbacks found themselves stuck in the dangerous terrain. The mobility that was essential to cavalry tactics was eliminated, leaving the French knights vulnerable to continued attacks. As the battle went on, the tactical flexibility of the English archers became increasingly clear. When French knights managed to reach the English lines, the archers could quickly switch to hand-to-hand combat using axes, warhammers, and other secondary weapons. This versatility allowed them to remain effective, even when their main weapons became temporarily unusable. More importantly, the archers' tactical organization allowed for mutual support, multiplying their effectiveness in close combat. While some archers fought French knights directly, others could continue to provide supporting fire, preventing French reinforcements from reaching areas of intense combat. The utter destruction inflicted by English archers on the French cavalry at Agincourt was documented by writers at the time on both sides who described scenes of killing that surpassed anything they had previously experienced. Thousands of French knights, including many of the most famous names in French nobility, were killed or captured. Many of the survivors were badly wounded. For the French, the defeat represented not just a military loss, but a basic rethinking of their assumptions about the nature of war. The believed invincibility of heavy cavalry, which had been the foundation of French military thinking for centuries, was shown to be wrong when faced with appropriate tactical and technological innovations. For the English, the victory proved that decades of investment in military development were worth it and showed the value of innovative approaches to warfare. The success of the English longbow system at Agincourt proved that small numbers of professionally trained and properly equipped soldiers could defeat much larger forces relying on traditional methods. The long-term effects of the Battle of Agincourt went far beyond immediate military considerations. The demonstration that technological and tactical innovation could overcome traditional number advantages influenced military development across Europe for generations. Many countries began trying out their own versions of longbow systems or developed specific ways to stop such weapons. The battle also had big effects on the development of firearms, which were beginning to appear on European battlefields during this period. The success of the English longbow archers showed that infantry using projectile weapons could be decisively effective against heavy cavalry, encouraging further experimenting with primitive gunpowder weapons. For England, Agincourt marked the high point of a period of military innovation that had begun decades earlier with experiments in longbow tactics. The battle's success provided proof for military approaches that valued professional training, equipment standardization, and tactical coordination over older feudal traditions. However, the very success of the English longbow system contained the seeds of its eventual becoming outdated. As other countries developed their own countermeasures and as firearms became more effective and reliable, the advantages that had made English longbow archers so powerful gradually disappeared. The English longbow's era as the dominant weapon lasted about 2 centuries, during which it deeply influenced European military development. Battles like Agincourt showed that systematic innovation could create decisive military advantages, a lesson that would inform military development throughout following centuries. When we look back on the Battle of Agincourt today, we see not just a spectacular military victory, but a transforming moment that shows the power of innovation to change established balances. The English longbow archer's secret weapon was secret, not because it was hidden, but because its full implications were not understood until it was so dramatically shown on the battlefield. The lesson of Agincourt goes far beyond medieval military history. It shows how combinations of technological innovation, professional training, and tactical coordination can create capabilities that dramatically exceed the sum of their individual parts. It was a lesson in the power of a systematic combination for revolutionary change. The legacy of the English longbow and its supreme demonstration at Agincourt continues to influence military thought today. The principles that made English longbow archers so effective, intensive professional training, standardization of equipment, precise tactical coordination, and being able to adapt under pressure, remain basic to modern military organizations. Ultimately, the story of the secret weapon that destroyed the French cavalry at Agincourt is a story about the transforming power of innovation when applied systematically and done with professional excellence. It is a reminder that even the most established traditions and advantages can be overcome when faced with genuinely revolutionary approaches to age-old problems. The Battle of Agincourt remains one of the most dramatic demonstrations in history of how a truly innovative weapon in the hands of highly trained professionals can basically change the course of not just a single battle, but an entire era of warfare. The English longbow archer's secret weapon had not only won a victory, it had changed a civilization. When King Henry V returned to England after his unlikely victory, he did not give credit for his success only to military innovations or the courage of his soldiers. In his words recorded by writers at the time, he said that the victory had been granted by the Lord God who had chosen to favor the English side despite the impossible odds they faced. This view was not just convenient royal talk, but reflected a deep understanding that even with all the technological and tactical innovations in the world, there were parts of human destiny that remained beyond purely material control. The English longbow had provided the tools for victory, but the coming together of factors that allowed its use so effectively, the rainy weather, French tactical decisions, the courage of archers under extreme pressure, seemed to people at the time evidence of divine help. Thus, the story of the secret weapon that destroyed the French cavalry at Agincourt remains not only proof of the power of human innovation, but also a reminder of the humility necessary when facing the complexities of history and destiny. It was a victory won through careful preparation, brilliant execution, and, in the words of the victor himself, the grace of the Lord God, who guided the events of that memorable day in October 1415.